You are now listening to the Counterflow podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow podcast. So this episode's a touch different, a little bit different than the usual format. This is actually my appearance on the Things Hidden podcast with David Gornoski. You probably remember David from just a few episodes ago. He was on this show. Shortly after that, I went on his show, and he's a great interviewer. He's a great person and a great guest on this show, and I really, really liked speaking with him on his show. So I wanted to be able to play it as one of my episodes. And from time to time, I do get messages saying that for whatever reason, you guys must be crazy, but you want to hear more of me speaking rather than just interviewing. So here's one of these chances. We can do that. This is my appearance on Things Hidden. And before I get to it, this week, as this episode drops, this week, Thursday, March 30th at 7 p.m. Central Time. Get that now, 7 p.m. Central Time is our Patreon supporter Zoom call. Special guest will be friend of the show, been on here a few times. You know him, and apparently you love him because many of you asked that he be the special guest this month. David Patrick Harry from the Church of the Eternal Logos YouTube show. It's going to be an open discussion with, of course, Q&A from you guys, but we're titling it Spiritual Warfare in the Material World. I'm really excited about doing this, not just for David Patrick Harry to be with us, but really to be with you guys. I'm stoked because I'm always amazed at the quality of Zoom supporter that I have. I think these Zoom calls have been great. You can join if you're not in this club yet, patreon.com/counterflow. $5 or more per month get you in the club. And it's been great. Again, these calls are not recorded. We can say whatever we want. It will never be released. It's just in the moment, and then it's over with. David Patrick Harry is this month's guest. I squeezed this in at the very last moment, right? It's March 30th, 7 p.m. Central Time, and hope to see you guys there. I know I'll see a lot of you there. I'm looking forward to it. Now, let's get to this interview. We talk about, David makes such a great comparison towards the end of this show. Many of you are aware that the first iteration of my podcast was called Death to Tyrants. Well, during this interview, which you could see on our YouTube page, I was wearing a Death to the World shirt. Y'all are familiar with it. I'm sure my favorite magazine, it's Orthodox Christian magazine, put out now, formerly by guest Justin Marler, and now by also Counterflow guest, Father John Valadez. So I was wearing this shirt. He starts making the comparisons spiritually to what death to tyrants means versus what death to the world means. That's a really great summation of it at the end. And I actually talk about my firefighting career in this way more than I ever have, I think, in any interview. Maybe second up. We'll see. But I don't often get a chance to speak on it. And I thought it was kind of cool to be able to do that. So here it is, without wasting your time any further, my appearance on Things Hidden with David Gornoski.
Today's going to be a great discussion. We have with us Buck Johnson. He's the host of the Counterflow podcast, and he's kind enough to have me on his program recently. I said, let's do a show. Let's continue our discussion on this program, Things Hidden. And the Counterflow podcast describes itself as dissident thought, unapproved opinions. Buck, thank you for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me, David. It's an honor. I love your work, so I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to bring you on and tell me a little bit about your podcast journey. That's kind of the anchor point for this conversation.
Yeah, it's been an interest. It's funny because I so often say, boy, I don't like that word journey, yet it is what it is, and it is a journey. So I wish I could think of a better way to describe it, but that seems to be a good one.
Why don't you like that word journey?
I don't know. That's a good question. I guess I need to just learn to accept it and like it because that's what this is, right? That's what we're all on. And so the podcast started in 2018, and it was called Death to Tyrants.
2018, is that right?
Yes, sir. 2018. I think January-ish, something like that, somewhere around there. I was steeped in libertarianism and anarcho-capitalist thought and content, and I still love Tom Woods and guys like Dave Smith, and the Mises Institute was always kind of my anchor point for libertarian thought, and those were the guys I looked up to and still respect quite a bit. I thought, if I start my own podcast, I'll get to meet some of these people and interview them and get their thoughts. That was one aspect. Another aspect was I'm a musician, and I have been in and around the music scene in Austin, Texas, certainly, but even really worldwide to an extent for a long time. And as your listeners and you might guess, a lot of the political persuasion within music is left wing. And I thought, maybe if I get libertarian thinkers on this podcast show, my musician friends, they already know who I am. They're going to listen, and I can slowly sway them into liberty and wanting more liberty for folks rather than just coercion and government force. And that failed. Lo and behold, that didn't necessarily work. However, the other aspect that I wanted, where I get to meet these thinkers and kind of, even shape my own thought further, that did work. And I've been able to interview some people that I really respect, Jeff Deist, Lou Rockwell, Tom Woods, throughout the years. And at some point, let's see, when was this? 2021, maybe? I should know these things better, these dates, these transitions in my own show. It became the Counterflow podcast. And at the time, I was friends and I suppose business partners with Thaddeus Russell. And he wanted me aboard his unregistered, I can't even think of what we called it. There was a podcast network, Renegade Media Podcast Network. And he said, I want you on it. And I said, sure, that's fine. And he said, we can't call it Death to Tyrants, though. You can start another show and be on my network. And I thought, I'm a firefighter. And so we work 24 hours at a time. So every third day, I'm completely taken out of pocket to do anything podcast wise. So one show a week was already enough for me. I didn't want another one. So I said, I've been thinking about changing the name of my show from Death to Tyrants to something else, because I had people turn me down just because of the name. And I thought,
they thought it was a violent show or something.
Mm-hmm. And it was thinkers that I respected and people who have since been on my show after the name change. Just, they didn't want to be associated. I guess that sounded too hardcore or too strident or something like that. So Thaddeus said, come up with a list of names and we'll discuss it. And so I did this long list, and Counterflow stuck with me. I liked that one the best. I mentioned it to him, and he's like, yes, that is you, because your political views are so counter to the mainstream. It flows against it. Even the fact that you're a firefighter, you run in and everyone's running out. You run counter to that action as well. The music I was into, I grew up in a subculture of punk rock and things of that nature. So even that was counter to the mainstream. So Counterflow seemed to work for that. And so we did that. And this is where the journey starts, where I started to discover Orthodox Christianity. And the show has turned to more of that topic. And that seems to be the backdrop now to the show, is Orthodox Christianity, spiritual warfare, things of that nature. But that wasn't really a hard line decision where I sat with I have two producers. I didn't sit down and think, guys, we're going into this direction of Orthodox Christianity, no more libertarian stuff. It wasn't that at all. It's just, I speak about and speak to people I'm interested in, speak about subjects I'm interested in. And as Orthodox Christianity's kind of enveloped my entire life, because I do think it's not just a once a week thing where you go on Sundays. It's an evolving worldview for me. And so that has now become kind of the backdrop of the show. And I've spoken, this is, kind of the same thing when I started the libertarian part. Now I've been able to speak to these spiritual leaders and priests that I respect and love so much. My spiritual father is Father Turbo Qualls, who I know has been on your show before. I love him so much. And I would not have met him without this podcast. So I'm really thankful that it's interesting. A podcast platform has given me the opportunity to meet just such wonderful people and kind of now direct my spiritual journey. It's crazy when you say it like that, but that's the case for sure.
How did you encounter, were you raised Christian, or did you convert from non-belief to Christianity when you discovered Orthodoxy? Did you have a road to Damascus moment where you were maybe in a burning bush or burning building?
I've been in a lot of burning buildings. So I was raised non-denominational Christian. And when I was in my teens, I went to a big mega church in San Antonio with the pastor named John Hagee. I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with him.
You went to John Hagee's church?
I did, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And at the time,
he's still going, isn't he? He's still preaching and stuff.
He is, yeah. His son seems to have taken over. And it's funny, I went to school, to at least 1 year of middle school with his kids. And so now I see Matthew Hagee. I mean, I knew him as a kid. Now I turn on the channel sometimes when I see Hagee's name, and I'll flip on for a second, and there's Matt up there preaching. So yeah, that's what I grew up with. I say grew up, when I was super young, we went to a Baptist church, and after high school, I moved away from San Antonio, and I got a career, and I was a musician in Austin, Texas, and that style of Christianity that I had been used to with John Hagee, it didn't sink into me. And so I kind of fell away from it over the years, especially through my 20s and 30s. And then I became what I would have called at the time an atheist. And I was reading some atheist material, the God Delusion book. And I became a fan of at least, not necessarily his politics, but Bill Maher and Penn Jillette and guys like that. And I was there would be times where I would lead with atheism. It kind of makes me cringe now in some of my discussions. And then I would
podcast, or you mean your private discussions?
Private discussions. I don't think I ever had it on the podcast, thank goodness. But yeah, certainly private discussions. It's funny because people just kind of casual friends now will listen to my show from time to time.
This is in Austin, these private conversations?
Yeah, for the most part. I will get these calls from friends. Man, I saw that you had this priest on your show, and it looks like you've taken quite the turn. That's so wild. You were this staunch atheist. And it's like, yeah, God works in wonderful ways. So certainly over 2020, I would say this with private discussions, and even some on the podcast with men like Lou Rockwell and Jeff Deist, they were allowing me to be more open about at least accepting Christian people's beliefs and being tolerant of Christian people. And you started seeing over 2020 what was going on. I don't want to get you in trouble, but some of the tyranny we saw. And I think it was Jeff that said to me something like, look around and who would you want to live by who's better on these topics that we're experiencing right now? And it was like, yeah, the Christians are. They seem to be at least fighting it more so than certainly the secular progressives, and they were the ones pushing a lot of that tyranny in 2020. And I started just being more open to understanding when things get bad, which it seemed like they were. And I guess this is very first world problems, right? To an extent, it's not like we live in sub-Saharan Africa or something like that, but it was bad. It was getting bad from what we were used to. My wife at the time wasn't allowed to work. She owned salons, and they're telling her, you can't go to work. Of course, they're telling me I still had to, and I wanted to. And I thought, well, she wants to work too. Why can't she? It seems so strange. And these progressives that are just throughout Austin were online spitting this poisonous venom about, you better stay home, people don't need haircuts and all of these things. And it's like, she just wants to work. She'll take precautions if, it was such a strange phenomenon that was happening. And I started becoming more open to spiritual ideas, looking around, and I was thinking, there's a true evil right now. Like, there's true evil. It's not just politicians saying stupid things. It's not just the John Stossel, I call it, the John Stossel view of politics, where, can you believe these guys are what dummies? It's like, no, there's true evil forces at work here. And I started to really think that. And I thought, maybe this secular, materialistic world that I had been living in and viewing everything as, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is spiritual work here at play. And then I started encountering the term Orthodox Christianity through some of my interviews on the podcast. And my friend Vin Armani, who now goes by Cyprian, had mentioned it many times. My friend Matt Erickson of the Kingfield podcast had mentioned it. And I just started getting more curious, like, things seem really bad. These guys that are pretty dialed in on explaining what we're encountering, they keep talking about Orthodox Christianity. So that got me really curious. And that was in 2021. And I asked Vin privately, I want to know more about this Orthodoxy thing. You seem really dialed in on what's happening. And you're saying that if I look at this through a materialist lens, that I'm missing the entire point, that this is spiritual in nature. How do I learn more about this? And he said, you need to order a small book. This is nice to get your feet wet into Orthodoxy. Father Seraphim Rose, and the book is called God's Revelation to the Human Heart. And so I got that. And for the libertarians, the Rothbardians out there listening, when you tell people, just read Anatomy of the State, because it's almost a pamphlet. And it was very much like that, easily digestible. It wasn't going to intimidate me. It's not like he said, get this 500-page book and then you'll be set. It was a very small book. And I was hooked. Within the first few pages, I started feeling this warmth in my heart. And it was so weird. And I was like, this is not the Christianity that I grew up thinking about or witnessing or seeing around me. This is something completely different. And it's so amazing. And why am I feeling this burn inside as I read it? It's so crazy. And so that's what pulled me into the Orthodoxy world.
What was different about what you read in that book versus what you had been taught by, Pastor John Hagee at that church?
Mm-hmm. Well, for one, Pastor Hagee, again, I don't want to get you in trouble. He leads with this, so it's not a bad word, but he's a Zionist. And just the default Protestant Christianity that I was used to, and this is not a knock on people that are Protestant, it's the version I encountered, was just kind of the more judgmental, heavily into the political world. Hagee and John McCain were very close. And as someone who was anti-war, I just started thinking it seemed not real. How could someone who was a true Christian be a Zionist and push for someone like John McCain, who we all know the evils that he was voting for? It didn't click in my mind. That just didn't seem Christian. And so when I read Father Seraphim, and he looked at it through more of a mystical experience, and he was talking about how Christianity and Orthodoxy is not necessarily an academic encounter, but it's a encounter where you lead and feel things with your heart and your soul. And it hit me like a ton of bricks, but in a good way. Not a ton of bricks hurting me, a ton of bricks like waking me up, so to speak.
Have you seen a lot of horrific things in your work as a firefighter?
Oh, yes. A lot.
Does it give you PTSD or things like that, or recurring dreams? Do you ever have recurring dreams of something you've seen
I don't think so. I used to, you live and you learn. I used to write off PTSD as something that sounded I just thought it was silly. And I was like, y'all are just using that as a crutch or something. I was wrong for thinking that, because there was moments where I did have it a little bit. I was at a house where there was a gas leak underneath it, and we could hear it. So we knew it was a pretty bad leak. You know, if people have heard gas leaks before, it's like a whoosh sound, but super loud. And we went in and got the family out really quick. And within about a minute after getting them out, which is not something we always do, but it felt like we should in this particular case, the house exploded. That's a very, for those of you who've never heard a house explode, it's pretty loud. And so that was fairly jarring. And
is that like a Die Hard movie where you see a big explosion like that?
Yeah, it was an old house too, like a 1920 something house. So really solid wood. And it was just incredibly loud and shocking. So there were times for the next year or so where I would hear that and it would jar me for a second. And I was like, wow, this is what they meant by PTSD. You know, soldiers and whatnot still hear, when they would hear a loud noise, it would kind of shake them for a second. So it did. It's not like it ruined my life by any means or caused me to seek therapy in the moment, but it did. I did hear that a lot. So I did experience it in that way. And I was at the busiest fire station I can't say the name of the city, but the city that I worked for. I was at the busiest station in that city for maybe 8 years. And so that's permanently basically messed my sleep cycle up, even to this day. So I have those experiences. And sometimes you'll picture some of the things you've seen before. Like I saw a college kid, we walked in, and unfortunately his parents had found him. They broke into his apartment because they weren't hearing from him, and he had blown his head off. I don't want to get too graphic for your listeners, but that's a sight you'll never forget as well. But it doesn't weigh down on my soul by any means. It's just things I think about from time to time.
Now, do you, just my ignorance on this, do you do only firefighting, or do you also do emergency calls when people call 911 to help people and all that?
Right. We mainly, that's the bulk of our calls is they're medical oriented. So we're EMTs, not paramedics. It's a different level of care. But yeah, most of our calls are medical in nature.
Have you ever seen anything supernatural, both good or malevolent, in those calls?
That's a good question. I don't think so. And boy, that is a great question. And I've not thought about it in these terms. I should kind of scroll through the mental Rolodex here and think about that. My initial answer is I don't think so, but I will have to think about that. That's a really cool question.
How has the discipline of your interest in orthodoxy helped your work in those emergency situations? Has it improved your ability to assess situations differently? Or
I think it's improved my ability to empathize with someone in the moment, because I've done this job for 25 years. And like I said, I was at a super busy station. There are times where you can become calloused to some of it. And it's just like, oh, I've seen this problem 100 times. But to that person in the moment, they haven't had that problem. They haven't seen it 100 times. And so orthodoxy's helped me be more empathetic in the moment to these people. And so I think that's an improvement for sure. And I just, you see an old person dying, or you're performing CPR on a grandma, and the grandkids are right there, or their daughter's right there. Rather than treating it just like another call and going through the motions that you're supposed to do, and these motions can legitimately save this person, it's just helped me see things in an emotional way, but not the emotional way where you're gonna get carried away on this. You can't, at the same time, you can't start crying or like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. You have to be professional, but it's helped me see it through a sweeter, more empathetic lens, I think. There is so much awful propaganda aimed directly at your children. With these 2 books I'm about to tell you about, you can at least help open up their mind to better ideas, not these crazy, progressive, poisonous, toxic ideas. My sponsor, Ollie Adamson, has created 2 wonderful children's picture books. The first one is called Strawberries Are Red, a story about compelled speech. It was inspired by a work policy restricting the use of gender pronouns during performance reviews. Leftist ideologies, and you guys know this, are heavily subsidized and continually thrust upon our youth by the media and in their schools, unfortunately. There's never discussion of ideas that occurs, and that's by design, right? Because they know their ideas will lose in an open discussion. These books promote conversation between parent and the child and incrementally tip the scales toward reasoned discussions of the topics at hand. The other topic we're going to talk about here in this ad, this book is called You're Not Welcome, a story about segregation. Sound familiar over the last few years? This was inspired by a work policy that actually placed Ollie, the author, on unpaid leave for 5 months due to medical mandates, we'll call it. This story presents and uses racial segregation as a backdrop before moving on to the issue of medical segregation and these policies that we all saw over the last few years. It takes no position on the safety or effectiveness of either masking or jabbing, but instead focuses on coercion that was used to achieve the establishment's goals. You can check these books out at ollieadamson.com. That's O-L-L-I-E, Ollie, and then adamson.com. They're also on Amazon. So once again, the books are called Strawberries Are Red, a story about compelled speech. You're Not Welcome, a story about segregation. I'm so proud to do an ad for Ollie, and I'm really glad he's sponsoring this show because these are very great books to get the young one in your life. Let's get back to the show.
So when you're new to that kind of a job, how do you control your emotions and everything when you're not desensitized yet to the shock of everything? Because the average person, the first day on the job being brought to at least observe grandma dying is going to be that's a pretty hard first day. I mean, I'm sure that's not literally your first day, but.
No, but
it
can. It certainly can be. You have to have people around you that can mentor you in that manner. And we also have within the fire department, there's what they call a peer support group, where there's people that are trained and certain therapeutic methods to, if you get stressed about a call or you witness even stuff in your personal life, really they can help you with. But certainly on calls at work, if it's kind of creeps you out or you feel some emotional, your heartstrings are being tugged at, you can sit with them and they'll counsel you through things. We have that available for everyone, which is a very handy service. For me personally, I was 19 when I started my first fire department and 21 when I started the one I'm at now. I think I was just too young to even get shaken by a lot of that stuff. So I've grown up with it in a sense. You know, I'm starting this career before my brain was even fully developed. And so I think growing up in it kind of helped me with that. I was never shaken, even when I was young, by this kind of thing.
Did you ever encounter a life-threatening situation where you thought, in terms of you were walking into a scene where there was violence in terms of a gunman or domestic dispute that was really hostile still while you're still trying to help someone or anything like that?
A few times. For the most part, those situations are controlled before we are allowed in. And so we have to wait for PD to basically give us the all clear, and then we go in. There were times, I remember there's an area when I was at that busy station, there's an area in that city that's the entertainment district. And this was it was prior to all of the craziness of 2020, but the spirit in the air was of evil was still a little bit floating around, and the tension between racial tension that was going on, you could still feel that. And we went there for a call on an assault, and a riot kind of broke out all around us. And they're like hitting our truck and throwing stuff at us. So, and we had to get out and help these people. So there were moments at that particular call, I can remember, you're watching your back thinking like they're going to start attacking us. And then during 2020, there were moments where they were in that same area where they were throwing fireworks at the fire engine and stuff. But we used to always hide under the fact that, like, look, these people, they hate the cops, not us. And then you started realizing through the last few years, like, well, they hate us too. And so I've experienced.
Why would they hate people who are trying to help people?
Good question. Because
You ever look into their eyes when they were coming at you in a mob state?
Yes.
What's that look like?
Possession of sorts, like that there's not a warm human being behind it. It's like this demonic look in their face. So maybe to answer your previous question about spiritual matters, maybe that was one itself, the spirit of the crowd, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty, that you could consider that work anthropological field work if you have the right assessment while you're doing your job.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that is kind of the double of sterile bureaucratic government and bureaucratic corporations is like, that's they're almost like completely related together, like the underbelly of the corporation and the bureaucratic controlled society with all of its sterility, but it's still a collective hive mind orchestrating it, denying your humanity. And then you go underneath it. And when it spills out, the energy is really wild and, untamed and more visceral, right? When it's spilling out into the street form of that collective spirit, it looks a little bit different, but it's basically the same thing.
Yeah. Powers of principalities, I suppose.
Yeah. When you were in those burning buildings, did you ever have a near-death experience? I'm sure you did, right? I mean,
yeah, a little bit, not as crazy as you might think, but I can specifically remember one where we were in this giant mansion that was burning, and as we walked through the front door to get to where we needed to get, there was a massive AC unit that just fell right through. I guess it was on top of the roof, and it fell right through, and what landed about, I suppose, 6 feet away from us. And we looked at each other like, wow, like if that happened 10 seconds prior to when it happened, we're dead. And really also one of the more dangerous situations we get put in my opinion, is traffic. So vehicle collisions on a busy freeway, there's cars just zooming right by you. And I've often thought that seems more dangerous to me even than going in a burning building, because all it takes is for someone to look down at their phone for a second and swerve into the accident scene, and it'll wipe everyone out. And I remember once I was on a freeway on an accident scene, and this tow truck was driving by, and it had this axle with smaller wheels that it kind of puts under the cars that it tows and drags behind. And there was no vehicle being towed, but it was coming. And I looked, I could see it from hundreds of feet away. This axle came apart from the apparatus it was attached to and started spinning down the street and then rolling right at us at probably 60 miles an hour. And as it got closer and closer, I was young, thank God. I don't know if I could do this in my age now, but it came at me and I basically box jumped it, and it kept going underneath me, and we're all yelling like, watch out. And by the time it got to the last guy, he could almost walk over it because it had lost momentum. But I thought, wow, had I not seen that, it would have just cut my legs out from under me, and I'd be a paraplegic. So thank God I saw it. So yeah, it's funny, the situations most people might not think of as when we are in danger that can actually be. In the house fires themselves, we're pretty good at recognizing when things go wrong, and they'll pull us out. The people in command will pull us out. I was in one where ammo started going off because it was in a room that was burning. So that's kind of jarring sound as well.
Why don't they have Dalmatian dogs anymore? You don't see those.
You don't. So they originally had those because they were the best dogs at the time to keep the horses going in the correct direction. So the horses would pull the old fire engines or the pumps, and the Dalmatians would keep them in line as basically guide dogs.
One of the most famous scenes that people still think about firefighting in America is 9/11, right?
Yeah.
That's where you get these legendary stories of, the firefighters going up into the building when everybody's fleeing and the whole situation. Can you give us insights as a professional as to some of the things that we take away from that? Like the idea of going up into a building when it's collapsing, and Is some of that, mythologized, or is all that real? I mean, there's always these stories that you hear about in terms of people getting these cancers and things from 9/11.
Oh, yes.
Any thoughts into why that was?
I know people that have.
Why?
Personally. And
how do they get cancer from going into 9/11?
So, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert, but I have heard from the actual people, there's several people I know that have dealt with this issue. In fact, one of them just died, about a month ago.
Mm.
He had stomach cancer, and he was my age. He was about 45 or so, maybe 48. He was in 9/11. So I don't know if people watching are aware of this, but they took just teams from many fire departments across the United States that went up there afterwards. And it's not necessarily the guys from FDNY that were in it when it collapsed, but it was after the collapse, these teams of people from around the United States, rescue teams and whatnot, went there to search through the collapse to find people still alive. And so they were dealing with, I guess when those buildings collapse, I don't know what kind of chemicals or fallout that you're dealing with, but apparently it was pretty serious. And these people were wearing, as far as I know, protective gear that we have to wear when you're doing things of that nature. But it affected so many people. Just, I don't know if it was the powder, what it was, but whatever's going on in those collapsed areas has had long-term deadly effects on firefighters.
Do you think that the level of bravery we saw in 2001 in the firefighters would still be happening in 2023 America? Or would there be a different?
It would be with the fire departments. It's certainly the one I work for. I have no doubt in my mind that people, if a high rise in the city that I work for was burning, yeah, we would absolutely go rescue the people.
Well, that goes to the question I was kind of going towards is, have you seen a change in the culture of firefighting over the years in America? Is there something different about it?
Yes. Let's see how I can say this without getting in trouble. Yes, there's a cultural change in the United States where I think due really to first world technology and first world privilege that the younger folks have grown up in, even more so than I did, has created what I would say is a weaker young generation. And there's a more, let's see if I can say this right, litigious nature, where if you don't do this, I'm going to report you, or I'll tell that you said the wrong thing, or just a more legal nature with litigation always in people's minds. Now, it's not, the fire department I work for is not ate up with that by any means. And I don't want to get into a bubble where I just see younger firefighters and I think, oh, they're so weak or they're so spoiled or whatever, because I recently spoke with a firefighter friend of mine who was off injured for a year, and he went and worked at this local coffee house. And he said, Buck, we are so lucky in the fire department. He goes, we get to where we'll bitch about the younger folks that they're more spoiled or used to not facing any real problems. But these kids that I worked with at the coffee shop, I've never seen a more mentally and spiritually weak group of people in my entire life, wrought with mental illness. And he said, and this guy used to be a vegan. So he kind of grew up in progressive society on the West Coast. And so he's not necessarily a cruel judge of character by any means, very open-minded. And he said, I was shocked. He said, there's so much mental illness in this generation that I worked with at the coffee shop. They're all in their 20s. All they do is cry about the patriarchy. And of course, we had a trans person there, and they were all open with me. And he goes, I'm thinking, aren't I the patriarchy? I'm a 50-year-old man. But he said they're all super open, talking about their problems with me, but I've never seen something like it in my entire life. And so while the fire department may have a younger generation that sometimes these old men like myself, the old guys, can bitch about, I think we're pretty lucky still to have really a solid group of men and women.
Yeah, I wonder, I bet there's kind of some parallels between like a good fire station culture and like a monastic life of brothers pursuing the faith, isn't there? I bet there's some lesson connections you could probably pull from both worlds together.
Correct. I've often thought that there really is. I've even joked that, I have my own little room at the fire station with a twin size bed. And I joke sometimes like, here's my little monastic cell. Now, of course, it's slightly more comfortable than the monks are used to, but yeah, there's in this brotherhood where you work together and the monks, the monastics are spiritually disciplined. We're working often on our physical discipline at work or our academic within the fire service disciplines. But yeah, I do think about that.
So you went from death to the tyrants to your shirt says death to the world. So you broadened your challenge, right? So how do you interpret the words death to the world versus death to the tyrants?
Well, I should read it aloud to be precise with it, but it's a quote from a saint, and my memory's failing me on which saint it is. And so within Orthodoxy, by the world, we're talking about the passions, and the passions are known as perverse inversions of God's energies that He's given us, right? So rather than humility, which is an uncreated energy from Christ, we often turn it into pride, the inverse of humility. So pride is a passion, lust is a passion, anger, not a righteous anger where we're to be angry about evil things, but just the selfish anger that I admit myself, as I drive to work here after this interview, I know someone on the road is going to upset me because of the way they're driving, but those are the passions. And so in Orthodoxy, we call collectively the passions, we call that the worldly passion. So this is one of my favorite magazines called Death to the World. It's an Orthodox magazine, and I call him Saint Seraphim Rose on the front of the shirt. He's technically Father Seraphim Rose, but he pulled me into Orthodoxy, so I proudly display his beautiful face. And so Death to Tyrants, which is funny, tattooed across the top of my chest. I got it from the man that shot Abraham Lincoln said that. He said it in Latin, thus always to tyrants, sic semper tyrannis, I believe, right before he fired that shot. So I initially lifted it from there, and I thought, as this strident, hardcore ANCAP, if you tread on me, you deserve to die. Death to all tyrants. And it's a little embarrassing saying it like that now, but that's kind of the attitude I came at it with initially.
Do you reject the anti-state posture that you used to held completely, or you just modify it in some way or contextualize it? Do you still, you don't have to use the term anarcho, whatever, but do you still hold to an anti-state disposition or no?
Not really. I certainly don't lead with it. It's not something that I find as interesting as I used to, where the state versus you. I always found that dynamic interesting, and I don't quite as much anymore. The state's there. It's going to be there. We're not going to get into a political situation without it, as far as I can tell. If we do, then I'll revisit this thought. But I think rather than the state versus you, a more interesting battle to discuss is the spiritual one, where you're either getting closer to unification with Christ or further away, and your soul's getting darkened rather than enlightened. And you can use material discussions like the state and certainly powers and principalities comes into that. But I don't lead with, I don't think we should have a state anymore. And I don't really think about it too often. So yeah, I guess that's where I stand on that.
Yeah, it's interesting that, Death to Tyrants is from a mimetic theory standpoint, kind of a continuation of the scapegoat mechanism, kind of we got off with that guy's head, which is,
Correct.
It's not an accident that as you drifted towards Christianity, that you found a need to get rid of that slogan as the banner of your mission, right? Because, that would be against the spirit of Christ. Is the crowd wants to say death to the tyrant.
Right.
But I think the Christian realizes the tyrant is a reflection of his own sin and his own tyrannical spirit as well,
Correct.
which is which would lead you to a statement like death to the world as rejection of the passions that leads to both the tyrant and the mob that replaces him with a new tyrant, right?
Right. Well put, David. Yeah. And I didn't even wear this shirt thinking about this aspect of the discussion, but that is, yeah, it's almost like death to tyrants is the perverse inversion of death to the world.
So what is the calling of your, what do you see the calling for you now that you have found the Christian faith, and how do you see your mission going forward, your vocation?
Which aspect of it? The
All of it.
firefighting?
Your music, your firefighting, your intellectual pursuits. Do you just see them as all continuing? I mean, what do you hope to accomplish with what you've embarked on with all these things?
What I hope to accomplish for myself is shedding away the dead weight of the world from my own soul and my own being. And so if I can do that through the podcast, that's certainly good. One thing I find interesting, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable saying this is what I want to happen, but it certainly has been a nice side effect of the direction my show's gone, is people coming to the Orthodox Church because of my show, which is fascinating. And it still feels like I say it feels heavy to say it like that. But I guess I'm not leading with that saying, here's my purpose to bring people into the church, because why me? I'm a sinner chief amongst them, as they say. But if someone's enlightened or moved by a guest that I have on my show, I would certainly, and they want to go discover Orthodoxy, I think that's wonderful. It's really great. So that's a good thing. With my music, I still have fun playing music. That's just more of a side hustle. I don't like calling it a hustle. It's not like I make much money off it. It's just a passion project, but not passion as in the passions. I have fun with that. And the job's great. I'm a lieutenant, so I'm a boss, and I have people that work under me. My job really is to make sure that they're all happy, safe, knowledgeable about the job, and squared away at work. And I try to lead with love for those guys and girls. I fail at times, but I certainly try to lead with love and humility, and maybe that'll rub off on them too when they become leaders too.
Do you think that history is going somewhere? Are we a part of something happening in history? Does it have us as a destination it's going towards?
Well, yeah, it's going towards what Revelations at some point, but I don't know how quickly. I think sometimes people get too into thinking that that's coming quicker than it really is. People have thought that for hundreds and hundreds of years. But that's what history is moving towards. As far as are we something, I don't know. That's a good question too. I would hope that America becomes more of a strictly Christian nation. I would call it Orthodox nation, but I don't want that to rub people the wrong way or turn others off. It doesn't have to be that, but I think it would certainly help things if people became more repentant and strive for humility more so than we do now. I think the culture now pushes the passions. It pushes the inverse of where we should be. So in other words, social media and media in general pushes objectifying human beings. It pushes narcissism. It pushes selfishness above all else. A thin veneer of prettiness or macho being, when underneath it never worries about what the empty soul that's sitting beneath the tattooed face on OnlyFans. And so I think if we could expose some of that and work with people on what's down inside rather than just what's the surface level happiness or independent nature of what they're doing, that would certainly be nice. And I guess that's my thoughts on that.
Do you think America is in grave danger of not existing as we've considered it in a few years, or do you think that?
Yes. I don't think it's grave danger. I mean, I think at some point the country's probably going to break apart, would be my guess.
How does the next decade or so of America's trajectory affect the opportunity for folks to encounter the faith in a richer way or a more significant, broader cultural way? How do you think that would play out, maybe?
Unfortunately, that often happens during hard times. And I preface this by saying I understand that there's third world countries and people with much less than I have, but I would have considered 2020 a hard time. And so that's what led me basically into the Orthodox Church. And so I do think times could possibly get tougher. I think what we're going to see unfortunately, with Ukraine and the sides developing up there, that's such an obvious example of spiritual warfare rather than material. It's being played out through the material, but they're trying to push the true church out of Ukraine. These monks that said they're not leaving, I was just informed yesterday, they have been given the blessing to be martyrs. And so when you hear things like that, it's chilling. If things like that continue, I think I hope people will start waking up. And if bad times come to this country, and I think it's certainly possible, that unfortunately, sometimes that's what it takes for people to come to Christ.
Yeah, but then you look at things like the Bolshevik Revolution and how long it took that country to get its Christianity back. I hope it doesn't take that long for us if we go through hard times like that, My God,
right.
Mercy.
Yeah, I think the ubiquity of social media and quick access to what's going on can help us alleviate suffering that long, I think, because it's easier to pull the wool over people's eyes. Oof, I hope.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing when you look at some of those cases. They have hard times and they stay debased for a long time. We think, maybe a couple of years in this, we'll clean it out. These people went decades and decades and decades of demonic possession. And then when they got rid of their Soviet Union, they had even more evil stuff with the oligarchs, causing ever-loving hell on everybody. That's just rubbing it in their faces. So I want to let you go. Anything people should know, be excited about, upcoming shows that people can look forward to as they check out your podcast?
Yes. Well, I don't know when this one that you and I are having will drop, but the episode that pumps out as we speak tomorrow, it will be March 21st, is one that I think people need to hear. And you and I touched on this topic when we spoke about it when you were on my show. I've got two wonderful, wonderful ladies, Orthodox Christian ladies, identical twins, coming on the show. And we are discussing what I like to call the devil's dialectic. So yes, they're tired. They're both ex-feminist, ex-progressives, ex-secular. They're actually the spiritual, not religious types. And now they're fully into the Orthodox Church. So they came from this nasty world of progressive feminism. And while we recognize that, yes, those types are using some terms and pumping out a lifestyle that's not very healthy for women, the opposite pendulum swing that we find on the right, Andrew Tate, people like this fake machismo, that's not good either. It's not just one or the other that we have to choose. It's not the devil's dialectic. And so in that discussion, we're talking about maybe a more royal path in the center of how to treat young women in today's society, rather than these guys, these incels on the right, just online treating them. Once you're over 30, you're just an empty egg carton and things of this nature. It's awful. And you're leading with the same demonic energy that the people on the far left have when you do that. And you're treating a woman, a female human being, as someone who can't repent and just an object. So I'm excited to have that one. And that's what I got coming up.
Very good. Yeah, objects are idols, so you know what they are idolizing when they talk like that.
Mm-hmm.
Buck Johnson, I really appreciate you coming on the program, and I look forward to seeing more from your work, and look forward to seeing what comes next. Counterflowpodcast.com is his website.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks again to David for having me on his show, Things Hidden. I look forward to having him back on mine sometime. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you thought or thought of it. Either way, they both make sense, I suppose, in the YouTube comments, if you will. Or you can find all of our links at counterflowpodcast.com. You can always reach out to me at buck@counterflowpodcast.com. Find me on Twitter at buckrebel, BUCKREBEL. Subscribe to the YouTube page, all these good things. We're on Rumble. You know the story, Odyssey, Rumble, all these things. And until next week, I will see you, and I hope to see many of you in the Zoom call this Thursday night. See you guys.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.